You know?
I know that much, but I can't remember. Far out.
Yeah. Why? How does that become backwards? I think there got to be a reason why.
We're going to get started today. Thank you all for coming. I see there's quite a bit of you. Today we have David Armstrong, and he will be presenting about mules in the mines from the period of 1898 to about the mid-1930s, when there were about 1,000 mules that were used in underground mining. These mules were the technology of the day, and in this talk about the fascinating part of Butte history, David will explain what the mules did underground and how they were cared for. Thanks again, David.
I'll let Tyler get the machine in there. I'm going to talk here on the Piper collection and all the subsides between the Emma Mine and the Pagoda. And the camera wasn't turned on for the first 5 minutes, so I don't know if we have this one. My name is David Armstrong. I'm a mining engineer. PE stands for Professional Engineer. I worked 36 years in mining companies, AMAX, Magnet Copper, Phelps Dodge Copper, BHP Copper, and I came up to Montana Tech to teach in the mining engineering department back in 2007, and I retired from there as head of the mining engineering department in 2013. So my wife and I decided to stay in Butte after that. I work Tuesdays at the food bank, if anybody's down there, do a lot of help up there at the World Museum of Mining, et cetera, just like you guys are. So that's my background. I got into this because Brenda Waller wrote a book, and she's given some talks in here. She wrote a book on Marcus Daly and his horses. She needed some background since she was a lawyer. She knew nothing about mining. Ellen Crane asked me to help her, and I found the subject of mules fascinating, enough to go ahead and take it to the next level. This was perfectly the other day.
Oh, that wrong button.
There we go. Let me start off here with this.
That's old Kevin Shannon's.
The U.S. Senate today, 49 Republicans and 51 Democrats.
That's the intro to what we're talking about today. And what I'm talking about today is the mules in the mine, and I'm calling it the technology of the day. And there's a reason for calling it the technology of the day. I'll show you in here. We can go ahead and... I'm so used to a mouse and having to go ahead and work with that with a pad. Yes. Okay. You're too old to work and you're too young to die. Figure out what this guy's doing out here. They put horses to pasture. They feed them on hay. Even machines. Here we go. Go back and do it right.
Then down is
There you go.
There we are. We'll start with technology today. The reason I entitled this Technology Today, this is how we would have gone ahead and hauled these ore cars back in the early days by man. You'll notice that the first mule power used in the mines took place in the place of men in 1898. Well, the next technology of the day was moving into the mule. This is Patty the Ghost, 1600 level, means 1600 feet below the top in there. So this is the mule. You can see it takes a little bit more space for the mule than for the man. And then finally, as quick as we could, we replaced the mules with the new technology today, the electric locomotive. So we'll talk about the mules during that time. Here's Babe, the only lady mule who chews tobacco, but a valued and faithful mine hand. Just to give you an idea of the size of the mules. I belong to the local Rotary Club, and I'm talking this afternoon. I wore my regalia because we're dedicating a mining heritage trail at Juarez Canyon. If anybody's hiked up the railroad track, below the railroad track, we now have a trail that goes through some abandoned or some collapsed shafts and some collapsed adits with some signs out in there. And so it's been interesting to go ahead and tie these together. And recently, the Mile High Backcountry Horsemen hauled water for us from the railroad track up our narrow trail to the Vista, where we have some bladders up there. So we hired weed sprayers to load up 4 gallons on their back and go down, squirt, 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 all the purple spotted knapweed and other invasive. So I got a chance to see how big these mules were. So Babe wasn't particularly big, but look at Sharkey, 1921. He had quite a write-up in the national news that came out and interviewed all the handlers. Big, big animals. So he had different sizes out there. Now, many of you may know about mules from Mike Burns' book, 2004. Turns out he copied quite a bit from Copper Camp, a good book on the source of Copper Camp. And there's many articles from around 1900 to 1920 talking about mules in the underground, how they're being phased out. So let's talk about Butte a little bit. I want to make certain we understand the mining portion of it. Here's Butte. We all know where it is. We know the pit over there. We know about our 3 copper kings of Daly, Clark, and Heinze. I want to give the timeline here. So in the 1860s, gold was found in 1864. It played out after a while. It became almost a ghost town here. In the 1870s, he found silver up by the Alice, way up high. And then in the 80s, Thomas Edison, the light bulb in 1879. Philadelphia wanted to be electrified, New York City, San Francisco, everybody wanted electricity. They needed copper wire for it. We had the copper. So in 1898, the first animals were underground. Charlie was introduced to the Pennsylvania mine, and Charlie was actually a horse. So the first animal underground here in Butte was 1898 at Pennsylvania mine. At its height, we probably had, in 1910, about 1,000 mules underground. We had 60 mining companies. And over the life, between 1898 and the mid-1930s, we had over 10,000 mules that were actually used underground. They died out quickly. As soon as we found electricity and we figured out a way of putting trolleys and wires underground, we went to the electric haul that I'll talk about here in a little while. So by 1919, we were down to 300 mules underground. And there are many different disputes of when the last mule was taken out. I will go with 1934, the last mules were taken out. There's one description of so many mules taken out of the St. Lawrence and so many mules taken out of the Emma. And that was the end of it. Other time frame we have along here, 1955, we started digging the Berkeley pit. It produced from 1958 to 1982. Montana Resources Continental Pit started in 1986. 1917, we had about 100,000 people here. And in 1906, 1910, we probably had 10,000 miners underground working. This was a huge complex, to the point that in 1920, if you believe Wikipedia, the Anaconda Company was the 4th largest corporation in the world. Today, we have Microsoft, we have Apple, we have Amazon, we have Google, and we have Metaverse. I can't remember what they are now. Meta, which used to be called Facebook. So those are the big ones you have today, but Anaconda being the 4th largest. We're talking big stuff. Here's that famous map by the Bureau of Mines and Geology here. And this is a small area. It's only 3.5 miles across in there. And World Museum of Mining is on the far left. So you only have a few square miles where all this occurred. We have 10,000 miles of underground workings. We have 50 miles of vertical shafts in there. The deepest being here, the Mountain Con, which is a mile high, mile deep. So let's talk about deep mining itself. Give you an idea of the scale we have. Eiffel Tower, a little over 1,000 feet. In the World Trade Center fell, they replaced it with the Freedom Tower, 1,776 feet high in honor of the Year of Independence. The tallest building in the world, the one that Tom Cruise climbed in Mission Impossible, the Burj Khalifa, 2720. To put that in scale of what we have here in Butte, the Orphan Girl Mine, 2731. It's 11 feet deeper than the tallest building in the world is high. And the Mountain Con at 5293 is their official depth. We're talking major, major work in going underground here. Now you may think about the miners when they first came in 1864 looked like this. The newer miners had to go ahead and do jacklegs and drill into the rock. We're talking solid rock because the placer was gone. And here's what a modern mine would look like, just to give you a bit of an idea. Here is the ore. Here in Butte, things dip at about 60 degrees. So you have this vein going down thousands of feet. Well, we don't put the shaft in the vein, we put the shaft over here. So as we mine, over here is going to be disturbed. Subsidence over here. This over here is solid. So as we go down here in Butte, every 200 feet, roughly, we go across with a crosscut into the vein. And then we mine on the vein hundreds, if not thousands of feet in this direction. We have to haul it back to the crosscut, bring it back here and up. And here's where the mules came in. We also had declines in there from time to time. We had declines in there from time to time. And as we mined down through here, for example, we would come across here and we start mining the ore and we'd mine it the 200 feet up to the next one. And then as soon as we didn't need the rail level, we'd mine through that because that's good ore. And we keep doing this all the way up and down the mountain. Digging was not a trivial task. We think that, gee, we should put these big machines in and go for it, but here's a family trying to do it themselves. This is what it would look like underground. You're working in very difficult conditions. You've got a track in here. You'll bring the ore cart in. You'll fill that by hand. Here we're drilling and blasting. It looks like they have great light down there. Similarly here, they're drilling and blasting. But I want to point out that the light down there wasn't really good. For example, those are candles. So they're working down there by candle light. Let me see if there's a seat for her. Yeah, raise your hand if you have a seat.
There's a couple seats back here.
I apologize for being late.
Oh,
That's fine. The allergies are getting to me today. So here we have candlelight drilling. And this is what the close-up of the candle would be. And the famous candle holder you've all seen probably. That's what's on the wall. So you're drilling by candlelight. You're blasting by candlelight. And then once you pull it out, here in Butte, Mother Nature put down this batholith, kind of layer of rock. I hate to have a geologist in the audience because I'm a mining engineer. Bear with me. So we have this layer out here. Mother Nature came and fractured just to beat the band, just really fractured over time. And then the fluids came in and fracture filled all the fluids with the fluids. So we have the copper roughly over by the pit, and then rings or halos of silver and lead and zinc and manganese going on out. But the problem is, as soon as you pull the ore out, it's so highly fractured, Mother Nature wants to fall on your head. So what we're doing is we're supporting it with these 10-inch by 10-inch posts. another post over here a few feet away, and a cap to hold that together. Then we go out 6 feet, put another post, a cap, and then a girt, a G-I-R-T, to tie those together. And then here in Butte, we put boards 2 to 3 inches all the way around, and now you're safe. But then we would go out another 6 feet, drill and blast, post, cap, girt, and lagging, and we're safe again. And we keep on going out, and if it turns out the vein is wider than the 6 feet, we have to go out in this direction, post, cap, girt. We have this little tinker toy set underground, which would look like this. And now as you come through there, exactly. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the square set timbering here in Butte. This is from Arizona, and in Arizona, they didn't have to support the top with lagging. This held up enough, so they had big stopes in Arizona. But to give you the idea, and here's another one from Arizona. We had this whole rabbit warren of timber underground. Now, remember we have this zone vein coming down, and so on this level, we have to go 200 feet up to the next level. So what we call floor by floor by floor, this is a floor, floor, floor. We'll go up, just shaving it off like eating corn on the cob, just mining it all, standing on the boards below you, and just keep on mining. Now you notice in here too, we have these chutes coming down. So as the ore falls down, it goes into these chutes. And then we'll bring our trains underneath to pick that up. For example, here, you can see that chute I'm talking about in here. We have the train track coming under here. So we'll bring the ore cart into here, we'll lift the board, and then we'll fill the ore cart, we'll put the board back down, and move on. Here's another example of one of those. But look how narrow this is. I don't know if you could actually get a mule through there or not. So we were talking on some of the historians in here. We know we started underground mining much earlier than 1898. Why didn't they use mules or animals underground before 1898? We have no idea. The best thing we can come up with is when we first started mining, they had all the timbers close together. So now if you want to introduce some mules, you have to deliberately go ahead and think about moving some of these supports further away, which means you have to spend manpower to go in there, support the back of the roof enough to move that post out all along that track. The other reason we think is because early on, the hauls were very short. As you're starting mining, you're only hauling it for a few hundred feet. And you and I can push it that limited amount. And then as we start getting longer hauls in there of hundreds of feet, that's where we want to go ahead and bring the animals in. So this is what it would look like in trying to go ahead and load and go. Just like the animals. The animals themselves, in mining in general, many of you are familiar with this. The reason I bring these up is, according to Byrne in his book, we had 10,000 mules over the life of the mine. In 1910, roughly, we had 1,000 mules underground, and he said we had 3 times that amount on the surface. So that's a lot of mules here in Butte. And in reading the stories, you have all the bakeries had mule teams, all the doctors had mule teams, all the dress shops, everybody had mule teams for the work. So here on the surface, when you see pictures of the Old West, you see pack animals like this, hauling materials around. Individuals, families coming in, they have mules of their own, so animals, so they have their own to contribute. And in remote areas, they could use the mules for packing materials in. This was long before the invention of internal combustion engines. We're talking the 1800s, early 1900s. The technology today was to use mules for all of this. One famous use is the 20 mule team borax out there in California. And that was from 1883 to 1898 until they put a railroad in there. So you had these monster loaded wagons that hauled 20 tons of ore, and they had a water wagon on the back side. Here's another view of it, of the animals themselves, the 2 ore wagons, and the water wagon. And it would take quite a while for the trip out and a trip back, so they tried new technology. One of the ideas was old Dyna, about 1896. They thought, we'll put this machine in here, and this machine with its big wheels will work. It'll double the output of the mule teams. Life is good. However, this monster, as you're going uphill empty with rear back on you, became a little bit of a danger. It also dug itself into mud and soft sand, needing constant maintenance, and it used over a ton of coal a round trip. So they retired after 1 year. The history of mining, particularly here in Butte, is we would try something. When a new technology came along, we moved the old technology aside, even though it was very expensive, because something was better. So the first use of animals was something called the rastra. And what we would do in those, we would throw rock in here, and the mule would drag this big heavy stone round and round and round, crushing it down to powder. Very cheap to put in, very easy to put in. Here's an example of another one, where it would just drag this big heavy stone round and round and round all day long. Another use we have, anybody seen the horse swim? We have an example of this up at the World Museum of Mining, hooked up. Well, the horse would walk round and round and round, and with gearing here, turning this shaft here, which would turn this little shaft, the shaft would turn here, and the drum here would wind the rope up and down to a pulley system, and it would hoist the bucket up and down out of the shaft. That was a very popular one. Here's another example of it, of the horse going round and round. Early on, the horse would have to back up. To lower the bucket, it would go forward to raise the bucket. And then through the engineering, they got it so that they were able then to have the horse just turn around and walk the other direction. If anybody goes up to the World Museum of Mining, we have the honor wall, and we have an example of just like this on the honor wall, wood and all. On the honor wall of all our 2,450 names of people that died in the mines, the mills, the smelters, the railroads, the warehouses, in Butte mining from about 1880 to 1995. Now here's what we're going to talk about too, is mules underground. So you can take a look at this one. And I marveled at this picture because these guys have pushed this ore cart out by themselves. And here's a perfectly good mule just standing there, brought some supplies up, and these guys are probably thinking, I wonder if we could hitch this to this and save ourselves some labor. Another way that they would do it is they would just go ahead and put sacks on either side of the animal, fill it with rock, and let the animal haul it out from the mine on those sacks. I love this one. Somebody had sheep. So we'll harness the sheep, and we'll let the sheep haul the ore out. And I can't tell if he's sitting on the car or not.
With those goats.
Thank you. They're thingies. Yeah, if I stand over here where you are, those definitely look like goats. Using the animals you have in the day. So here's another example of over in coal mines in England and back east. We have lower ceilings. The back is fairly low. We don't have a lot of space in there. So rather than using mules like Sharky, we're going to use little animals like this and like this. So you can see that that ceiling, the back up there, is not very high. You can imagine going in there yourself, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet, and you're out there mining, filling those ore carts you have back there. There's a guy right there. And then having this little horse haul it out, or mule. Here's an example on surface. The reason I like this one, you can have 1, 2, 3 heavily loaded cars. You and I could only go ahead and push one at a time, about a ton in there, and hopefully the grade isn't too bad. But the animals would haul up to 6 cars. A man would haul 1, the animals would haul up to 6. There's some great stories on that. They could count. And some of them would haul 4, and whenever you try to put a 4th one on, they would stop. Or a 5th one on, they would stop and refuse. By the way, does anybody in here own mules? I'm always looking for the ringers in the audience. That's why I wanted to find out. Because all I know about the mules I found on YouTube. And I've watched a few things other than that. So here's one with 2 horses pulling. This is a coal mine up in Canada. They have a big main line there. They have single horses hauling small carts in. And they went ahead and hooked up a whole amount out here and had 2 horses lined up in here. So here's what Butte looked like. This is where Butte comes in. So we have a very narrow area in here. We have a lot of overhead piping and other timbering, cross timbering, that the mule has to avoid as it goes along there. And they would haul out these carts. This is just the standard way that the Butte did it for years and years and years. Let's talk a little bit more about that before I go on. The mules would be brought down, and I'll show you that in a few minutes on how they were brought down. They were brought down and they were put into these horse mule barns, underground. Now, a typical mine would have 2 to 8 mules per level. And every level would need its own mule barn. So we're not going to go ahead and take them up and out every night. We're not going to go ahead and put them all together and take them down to the next level. And they would just go in there and spend the rest of their working career in that area. So they were tended very well. The mules were treated better underground than they were on the surface. They had fresh water every day. They got the best of grain. They got the best of straw down there. And then every night they would get their hooves tended to, because they're walking along in this copper sulfuric acid. It will eat out the iron on their horseshoes. So every night they would get a nice bath and rub down, just go ahead and keep the horseshoes from rotting on out, keep going as long as we could. So the horse barns, we don't have any pictures of horse barns here in Butte, unfortunately. I wish we had these. So here's an example of a horse barn. It would just be a drift, and they just go ahead and put in horses. I don't know if you can see that one or not. Here's inside of a coal mine, and they have all the feeding levels out in here, so all of they can eat there. And we just back the mules into that. And you notice up in here that they have lights. So instead of leaving the mules in darkness, they would go ahead and light it for them. Here's an example down in Bisbee, Arizona, of what the mule barns would look like down there. When they went ahead and did some excavation, and so the mule would be backed in, it would have a bar across, and hopefully it would enjoy being down there. Maybe not. So to me, one of the more fascinating parts, and somebody has some pictures from the Anaconda mine doing the same thing, of how do you get a mule mine underground. If anybody's been out to the World Museum of Mining and you look at that cage, it's about 3 foot, probably 3 foot, probably about 8 foot high. So somehow you got to get a mule through that. And the same thing for all these dozens and dozens of mines around Butte. Somehow you got to get that animal down. So here's how we do it. This is from the diamond mine in 1908. So we have a mule we want to go ahead and take underground. So the first thing we do is, you notice we've taken a foreleg and we've gone ahead and brought it up and tied it in so that doggone animal cannot kick. That's a very important thing. Those hooves back there are very, very vicious. I don't know if your mules are ever that way or not.
They sidekick.
Sidekick? Oh, okay. So as a result, that was the first thing they would do, is they would tie up the foreleg. Then what they would do is they continue putting a harness around it and doing more rope work. And the third thing they would do then, they invented a straitjacket. And so this straitjacket they would put around the mule. Wait until you see what the next slides look like. But on this one, they would start with this straitjacket around the mule. Then it got even more, particularly up here in the head region. And they brought it down to its knees, because what they're going to do now is flip it on its side. Now, they flipped it on its side. It's totally harnessed in there. You can barely blink. It's just tied up. Some of the reports say they would go ahead and go several days without food to begin with as a way of precursing it. I don't know. But that's what one of the stories would say. And then they would put it on its sled. They put it on its back, put it on a sled, so now they can haul it over to the head frame. Once it got over to the head frame, then head up, they would either stuff it into the cage or they would dangle it below the cage. One or the other. So here's an example of being stuffed in the cage. And so this is what it might look like in there. So the animal's way up here, people are up there working with it. You can see this is a production. This is why mules didn't come out every day. You had to go ahead and put them in, and they stayed there. So here's a production. Here's another one I saw, and I looked at this because one of our famous, Ellen Baumler, wrote an article, and she said that the animals were lowered into the mine head down. And I thought, that doesn't make any sense. So I was talking to some mule people, and they were saying, no, it's too much stress. So I said, this one almost looks like the mule has the head down here, until I looked at this horseshoe right here, and I realized that horseshoe, the way it's going, the head has to be up. So in my mind, 100% of them were head up, and that's the way we went ahead and did it. Now in this example, it's stuffed onto the cage. There are some examples. This one I want to point out here. This is on a beautiful day like today. Maybe it's a little bit hot today to do that. Remember, we're in Butte, Montana. You can imagine doing this in December, January, February. Those guys are outside. There's no roof over their head. There's no snow blockage. They're out there, just like at the Orphan Bureau at the World Museum of Mining. You're outside doing this. And I can imagine, these were done in April. So these pictures were in April. They look good. I got no problem with that. But in the heat of summer, it's one thing, but in the dead of winter, it's got to be brutal. Because they have to deal with these animals year-round. So here's another example where they're hanging below the cage. And this is an earlier style of harness also. We had a vet, John D. McGregor, who came in 1889 to Butte. And David hired him to take care of the mules on the surface. And he invented the straitjacket. He didn't like the way that these guys were being lowered, so he invented that straitjacket you were seeing before as a kinder, gentler way of getting the mules underground. So here's an example. Here's another example of a lithograph of how you lower the animal underground. The animal doesn't look particularly great, but again, this is a drawing. This is not an actual photo. And here's one from England where they had this huge structure inside. It's all ventilated and covered, and the animal's being lowered down on a heavy, heavy chain down below. And so down below, when they got there, they would be taken off, put into the drift itself. We're talking about wherever they're going. Then they would be freed up, and they could prance around and bounce a little bit. And then they could go ahead and go to the work area. They put them in the stable for a day or two, let them get calmed down. And then what they would do is they would walk them around their route, or where they were going to have to be walking. So they'd walk them around that route a few times, and then they would chain them to an empty ore car and do the same thing again. They did that a few times before they actually put them into production. By then, they knew the route. And so then they could go ahead and haul their 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 cars behind them, and they would do that for years and years and years in there, where they knew the way probably better than the miners did. They knew when to duck, they knew when to move, and they were smart enough that the song I had there said that they tended them without any lines. Like Babe, the first mule I showed, did not have any lines. She had no bridle on her. Others would say it was one line. But what these mules would do, they got trained so much that they had the string of 4 cars behind them. They would go forward until the first car was at the chute, and then the tender would go ahead and fill the ore car, and then say something like, "Go mule." And the mule would walk far enough forward and then stop enough for the second car to be filled. Then they say, "Go mule," and it would move forward far enough for the third car to be filled. So that the actual mule tender didn't have to keep directing the mule after a while. The mule knew exactly how many paces. And then when it was full, they'd just tell the mule to go, and it would haul it wherever they had to go. Now, what was nice about mining is we didn't mine horizontal on these levels. We mined at an angle, a very 2-degree angle. And the reason is, it was sloppy and wet underground. we wanted to drain towards the shaft. So then in the shaft, all the water would go down to the sump and we could pump it out. So it avoided having a lot of mud back there in the workings. So the mules then, the mules then would be able to haul loaded downhill at a slight angle, and then they would be able to go ahead and haul empty at the up level. Now there were a few ups and downs in there where it got a little tough, and they say, and I'd love to see an example of that, but they said on some of these spots where the mules actually had to shove the cars up, they would walk around and push it up with their chest. There are several articles talking about how they did that. And then the mules would go back to the head of the train and continue pulling. So the mules were fantastic about being able to go ahead and help. Here's one I love, West Calusa Mine. It was the largest in the state, 9 by 18. I'm going to come over here by you. That's fine. I want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is 18 feet from that wall. So 18 feet by 9 is about to Tyler. So we're talking about an area in here, that was the shaft, that was the largest in the state, going down thousands of feet. But what's interesting here at the bottom is said that the size of the cages will permit the hoisting and lowering of the mules each day. So you bring the mules out every day. You don't have to go through that work. So I ran across a picture here not too long ago that showed how it was actually done. So this was a horse on the cage, and there's the guy next to him. And the horse looks pretty happy because it's not in harness, it's not blindfolded in there. And maybe they did go ahead and bring it up and down. That article and this picture are the only references I've ever seen about the daily bringing in and out of the mules. But still, if you have 2 to 8 mules on every level, and if you have mules on 4 or 5 working levels, that's a lot of work to go ahead and bring those up and down every day. I don't know if it actually played out that way or not. A lot of myths involved with the mules. I wish Larry Hoffman was here, he's my guru, on talking about whether or not mules went blind. As to animals going blind, total horse punch. For those that know Larry, that's a good quote. This travesty is a romantic assumption by riders who have never been underground. The mules worked with the miners who certainly didn't operate in the dark. Candlelight was dim, certainly, and there were times the best animals would just know their way in the dark from point A to point B, but no reason at all to become blind. Just the opposite, sharpened acuity. I love this. This is one of my several pet peeves found in mining history, written by the ignorant. I read several places, and I talked to people who said, oh, I heard the mules went blind. No, they didn't. If you've ever been in a darkened room on a sunny day, and you come outside, you feel blinded for a little while. And the mules were exactly the same way. So when they brought the mules out, for some reasons I'll talk about in a minute, they would cover their eyes to begin with, and they would keep them covered for a period of some hours, just so they could adapt to the light. Or, even better, they'd bring them out at night. When they bring them out at night, and in the morning they would adapt to the sunlight coming on in. British had all sorts of rules and regulations, and one of the rules and regulations of the British was you were not allowed to use a blind mule underground. So that's a great myth, but it just wasn't true. Another myth was I've heard that, well, they only worked a certain number of years and they were brought out. No, they worked until they were no longer usable underground. Just kind of realities of life. So typically they worked about 5 years on average. There's 2 mules in here. Emily, 18 years at the Emma mine, Tim, 14 years at the diamond mine. The article on Emily said that she was still one of the strongest mules underground, even though that she had been out there for years and years and years. They worked an 8-hour shift. I was spending some time at the World Museum of Mining this morning because a lot of the articles say the men would work 12 hours, the mules would work 8 hours. And we were trying to find out when we shifted from 12-hour work days to 8-hour work days. And it appeared around 1900 as best that Kim Cohen could find. So another one that the men would get a half an hour lunch and the mules would get an hour lunch. So I'm trying to find out, what do they do in that half hour difference? Well, the men would usually eat at their workplace. And so maybe they would go and do some other repair work, some maintenance work, waiting for the mule to finish up with their R&R. I don't know. So we had 2 to 8 mules per level. 1910, we had 60 mines with 1,000 mules, and then probably 10,000 mules underground throughout that life of 1898 to 1934. Others, I was walking down one day from the Granite Mountain Memorial down Foreman Park, and there was a sign there saying that mules were brought out for R&R, for rest and recreation. I thought, what? Why would mules be brought out for R&R? Balderdash. Well, mules stayed underground until they were sick, in which case we brought them out. They died, in which case you had to get them out because the stench was going to be too bad. Somebody said, well, doesn't you just throw them down the shaft? No, probably not. And the third, quite often there was a union strike. And there would be no people underground to take care of the mules. Also, the miners knew in dealing with the company, if they were going to go on strike, if the company invested enough money to start bringing mules out, it was probably going to be a long strike. However, it turns out that I found articles saying that if the mule was balking, I guess mules were balking, they were able to go ahead and kick 10 foot high. They were able to kick down all the stalls they had. They were biting miners. They were just big, miserable. They would bring them out for a while, R&R, put them out to pasture for a period of time until they settled down, and then put them back down underground. So it's true they did get a little bit of R&R. Another one, mules were treated cruelly. I was trying to find out from the Mile High Backcountry Horsemen if they'd ever heard of cruelty. And the answer is yes, just like people abuse their children, they abuse their cats and dogs and horses in today's society. There were probably people back there pick up a 2x4 and try and talk to the animal. But as it says in here, the mistreating mules underground, I saw several references. That was one of the quickest ways of getting fired. If you mistreated a mule, because it was company property, the mule in poor condition, it's going to cost the company a lot of money, and if it died, it meant another one needed to be bought to replace it. So underground, they became pets. You read the stories about the mules. For example, Babe loved tobacco, and smoking back then was allowed. So she, whenever you lit up a cigarette, she would come next to you and sniff the smoke. They loved peerless tobacco, so they found out which pocket was your chew it was in, and they would grab that. They loved lunch pails, and so they would go ahead and either kick it over, and if that didn't work, they'd stomp on it, open it up, and eat the miner's lunch. So the story after story of the mules doing that, all the personality that these individual mules had, and the miners would train them to find out which pocket was in, so they were doing it to themselves. But the mules were wonderful in that respect. I found out that mules back in 1913, at the kind of the height of this, were going for about $200 each. The men up until 1906 were paid $3.50 per day. And a mule was taking about $50 a month to maintain. Plus you had, that's where you bring all the hay, the feed, the water, everything else for that mule. Plus you had somebody to tend the mule along. So you had one miner who had to go along with the mule, take care of it. You had another one operate the chutes in there, so you had two miners involved with every mule train. And then you had somebody at the stable to go ahead and take care of the animals in the stable. So you're putting a lot of overhead in that, plus every one of the mines probably had a farrier for horseshoe. A lot of cost involved in that. So the mine mule was about $200 back in 1913, and you can see the horses in the blue line, the mules in the red line. Mules cost even more than horses because they were valuable. Why the mules were valuable? Well, here's part of the reason. The mule, according to miners, shows more intelligence than the horse about many things. For instance, when his long ears touched the timbers over him, he will lower his head, bend his knees, and crawl through a small space. When the same thing happens to a horse, he is frightened, throws up his head, and refuses to proceed unless he is led. Score 1 for the mules. Another one. The mule again has a noticeable advantage in toughness and endurance, and he shows more speed than the horse. When pulling a train of cars, he always goes at a trot. Can you imagine pulling 3 and 4 and 6 carts and trotting along instead of just trudging? While a horse walks as slowly as it can walk and avoid being run down. Remember, you're going on a downhill incline to the shaft, 2% incline, so the cars behind you want to come and kind of goose you along. And as a result, that there was a brake, actually a bar that the motorman, the mule tender, could put under the wheel to kind of slow it down if you wanted to. But we don't want to lose the animals by being run down. Okay, so why mules over horses? Well, here's several reasons why mules over horses. One of the most sure-footed animals known. It tolerated the heat a whole lot better than the horses did. Remember the Belmont Mine, there's spots in there of 120, 130 degrees in the Belmont Mine. The Orphan Girl is fine because of shirt sleeve weather, but many of these mines were 100 degrees plus. They're great endurance, which we needed. They're very quick in their movements, a drop of good stress, better eyesight than horses. Score 1 for the mules. Here's what that article has said here. They carry their head slower to avoid obstacles better than horses, more steadiness compared to horses, easier to turn in tight passageways. It turns out they were saying for the horses, if you have to turn them around, it's kind of like to get the horse turned around, where the mules were much easier to turn in there. If you're working like a miner, you want things easy. You don't have to sit there and worry about all these things. Rarely became ill or suffered wounds, and this is one that probably they liked. They did the work of horses, but they ate a whole lot less. If you remember the stories of in the old days, it's all about production, it's all about profit. And so if you can get the same work for less food, less money, you're going to go ahead and do it. So finally, this is just the emotion between a miner and his animal. They were loved, the miners took great care of them, and together they did great around mining. So with that, that's the presentation for today.